Gisella, you're using too much hot water again. Do you know how much our utility bills have gone up since you moved in? We're not running a charity here. My daughter-in-law Vanessa said this while standing in the doorway of my attic room, arms crossed, her yoga pants still spotless at 3 in the afternoon. I was rinsing out a single teacup in the small sink I'd installed myself. One teacup, and I swear, at 67 years old, I finally understood what people mean when they say they felt their blood turn cold. I didn't respond. I just stood there with the water running, watching it spiral down the drain, and wondered when exactly I had become invisible in my own house. The house my husband Marco and I bought in 1982, when this Brooklyn neighborhood was still rough, still affordable, still ours. Vanessa was already walking away, her footsteps echoing down the narrow attic stairs. Through the floor, I could hear Marcus, my son, laughing at something on television. Little Marco, my grandson, was probably in his room with his headphones on. He was the only one who still climbed those stairs without being asked. I turned off the water and dried the cup slowly, methodically, the way I'd been taught by my mother, who learned from her mother, waste nothing, hurry for no one. But somewhere along the way, hurrying for my family had become my entire existence, and now they treated me like I was the one asking for favors. The attic had been my sewing room once. High ceilings, good light from the dormer windows, enough space for my industrial machine and the dress forms I'd collected over 40 years of tailoring. I used to make wedding dresses here, communion gowns, suits for men who wanted something that fit like it was made for their body alone because it was. But 5 years ago, when Marcus lost his job and Vanessa was pregnant with little Marco, they asked if they could stay just for a few months while they got back on their feet. I said yes. Of course I said yes. That's what mothers do. I moved my sewing equipment to one corner and made room for their lives. 5 years later, I was still in the attic. They were still downstairs, and the few months had become forever. That night, I sat in my chair by the window and looked out at the street below. The brownstones across the way glowed with warm light, families having dinner together, parents and children around tables that weren't too wide, in rooms that didn't feel like occupied territories. I reached for the wooden box I kept beside my chair. Marco's box. My Marco, not little Marco. My husband had been gone 12 years now, died of a heart attack in the hallway downstairs while carrying groceries. Just dropped. The doctor said he didn't feel anything. I hoped that was true. I hoped a lot of things were true that probably weren't. Inside the box were his things. His watch, the one that stopped at 2:47 p.m., a few photographs, and letters. Not love letters, exactly. Marco wasn't that type, but notes, reminders, little pieces of paper he'd leave around the house. Don't forget you're stronger than you think. This house is ours, Bella. Every brick. Never let them make you small. I unfolded one of the notes now, dated from 2008, 2 years before he died. If something happens to me, remember the deed is in both our names, then just yours. No one else, ever. I'd forgotten. Or maybe I'd chosen not to remember. After Marcus and Vanessa moved in, there had been so many conversations about helping out and contributing and doing my part that somewhere in the fog of it all, I'd started to believe I was the guest. But I wasn't. This was my house. The deed was in my name. The property taxes came to my address, and I paid them every quarter from the account Marco and I had built together. The same account that somehow always seemed lighter than it should be. I stood up and walked to the small filing cabinet I'd shoved into the corner behind my dress forms. Inside were folders, bills, statements, papers I'd signed without reading because Marcus said, "Ma, it's just paperwork. Don't worry about it. I'm handling everything." But now, in the quiet of my attic room, I started pulling folders out. I started reading, and what I found made my hands shake. Bank statements showing withdrawals I didn't make. 500 here, 1,000 there. Always just under the amount that would trigger a fraud alert. always with Marcus's name on the transfer authorization. Authorization I didn't remember giving. I found property tax bills that I'd paid. Every single one. But I also found emails forwarded to my account, emails I'd never opened, from Marcus to Vanessa. Don't worry, Ma's covering it. She doesn't even check the account. Another one. Once we get her to sign over the house, we can refinance and finally get out of here. Get out of here. My house. The house I'd raised Marcus in. The house Marco and I had scraped together every penny to buy when we were young and brave and stupid enough to believe in Brooklyn before anyone else did. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just sat on the floor, surrounded by papers, and felt something inside me that had been bending for years finally snap straight. The next morning, I woke before dawn. Old habit. When you've spent your life working with your hands, your body remembers to rise before the world does. I dressed carefully. Not my usual house clothes, but a dress I'd made myself. Navy blue with buttons down the front. My good shoes. My mother's earrings. I wanted to look like someone who owned property, not someone asking for permission. I left the house while everyone was still asleep and took the subway downtown to the office of Robert Chen, the lawyer who'd handled Marco's estate. He was semi-retired now, but when I called him the night before, he said he'd see me first thing in the morning. His office smelled like old books and coffee. He looked older too, thinner, but his eyes were still sharp behind his glasses. "Gisella," he said, standing to greet me. "It's been too long. What brings you here?" I handed him the folders. Every single one. He spent 20 minutes reading through them in silence, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. Finally, he sat back and removed his glasses. "This is financial exploitation. Elder abuse. You know that, right?" I nodded. I knew. I just needed someone else to say it out loud. "Your son has been withdrawing money from your account without proper authorization. These signatures, they look like yours, but the consent forms aren't legally binding. You were never properly informed. And this," he tapped the emails, "this shows intent, premeditation." "What can I do?" I asked. My voice was steadier than I felt. He leaned forward. "First, we secure your assets. I'll contact the bank today. All accounts will be frozen and then reopened in your name only. Second, we revisit your will. Third, we discuss whether you want to pursue legal action against your son." I thought about little Marco, 9 years old, sweet boy. I don't want to destroy him. I just want to protect what's mine. Robert nodded. "Then we set up a trust. The house goes into a trust for your grandson when he turns 25. Until then, you maintain full control. Marcus has no claim, none. And if you want, we can require him to pay fair market rent or vacate." "How much is fair market rent?" I asked. He pulled up something on his computer. "For a 3-bedroom in that neighborhood, $4,000 a month, minimum." I felt dizzy. 4,000. They'd been living there for 5 years, paying nothing. That was $240,000. Money I could have used. Money I'd needed for doctor visits I'd skipped. Medications I'd stretched. A life I'd compressed to make room for theirs. "Do it," I said. "All of it." That afternoon, I returned home with a briefcase full of documents. The house was quiet. Vanessa was out. Marcus was in the living room, my living room, watching television on the couch I'd bought with Marco in 1985, the same couch I'd reupholstered 3 times because I couldn't bear to let it go. "Ma," he said, barely looking up. "Where were you?" "Out," I said. I walked past him to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water from the tap. I drank it slowly, deliberately, using whatever water I wanted. That evening, little Marco came upstairs to visit me. He did this most days now, sneaking away from the television, from his parents' arguments about money and work and whose fault everything was. He'd curl up in my chair, and I'd tell him stories about when I first came to America, about learning to sew, about the wedding dress I made for a movie star once who I promised never to name. "Nonna," he said, using the Italian I'd taught him. Why do you live up here and not downstairs with us? The question hit harder than I expected. This used to be my sewing room, Tesoro. Your parents needed space when you were born, but you never sew anymore. He was right. My machines were still there, buried under boxes of their things. My fabric, my patterns, my life's work, all pushed aside. Maybe I will again, I said. He smiled. Can you teach me? I want to make something. And there it was. The reason I couldn't just walk away angry. This boy, this sweet, curious boy who still saw me as a person, not a burden. Yes, I said. I'll teach you. The bank moved quickly. By Monday, all my accounts were secured, my name only. By Wednesday, I had a new will, a new trust, and a letter from Robert Chen addressed to Marcus Romano. It sat in my purse for 2 days before I found the courage to deliver it. I didn't hand it to him in person. I couldn't. Instead, I left it on the kitchen counter Saturday morning, propped against the coffee maker where I knew he'd see it. Then I took the subway to Robert's office and waited. Marcus called at 10:17 a.m. I didn't answer. He called again at 10:23, again at 10:31. At 11, he texted, "Ma, what is this? Call me." I didn't. I sat in Robert's office drinking tea and letting my son sit with what he'd done. At 2 p.m., I finally went home. Marcus was waiting in the kitchen, the letter open on the table. Vanessa stood beside him, her face red, her jaw tight. "You went to a lawyer? Behind our backs?" "I went to my lawyer," I said calmly. "About my house, my accounts, my property. We're family," Marcus said. His voice had that edge to it, the one that used to make me back down. "Not anymore. Family doesn't steal," I said. I pulled out the bank statements, the emails. I laid them on the table between us. Family doesn't forge signatures. Family doesn't plan to take someone's home while pretending to help. Vanessa looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at the papers. The silence stretched out, heavy and thick. Finally, he said, "We were going to pay you back." "When?" I asked. "When were you going to pay me back? After I was dead? After you'd convinced me to sign over the house? After you'd drained every account?" "That's not fair," Vanessa said. "We let you live here." I laughed, actually laughed. It came out sharp and bitter, but it felt good. Let me? Let me live in my own house? The house I bought 32 years before you even met my son? She blinked. The math was finally reaching her. I pulled out another document. The deed. I placed it on the table, my name clear in black ink. Gisella Romano, sole owner. "This is mine," I said. "It has always been mine. And now you have a choice. You can stay and pay rent, $4,000 a month. Market rate, or you can leave." "4,000? Marcus's voice cracked. "Ma, we can't afford that." "Then I suggest you find somewhere you can afford. You have 60 days. I left them sitting at my table, in my kitchen, in my house. I climbed the stairs to my attic room and closed the door behind me. My hands were shaking. My heart was racing, but I wasn't bending anymore. The next morning, Vanessa didn't speak to me. Marcus tried once. A half-hearted "Ma, can we talk about this?" that died when I said, "Talk to my lawyer." They moved through the house like ghosts, whispering in corners, slamming doors just loud enough to let me know they were angry. But little Marco still came upstairs. If anything, he came more often, away from the tension, away from his parents' arguments. "Nana, are you okay?" he asked one evening. "Yes, Tesoro, I'm very okay. Dad says you're kicking us out." I looked at him, this boy who had his grandfather's eyes. "No, sweetheart. I'm asking your parents to respect what's mine. That's different." He nodded slowly. "Can I still visit you, after we move?" My throat tightened. "Always. You can always visit me." That night, I started sewing again. For the first time in 5 years, I cleared my machines, pulled out my fabric, and just made something. Nothing specific, just pieces coming together. stitches in straight lines, the familiar rhythm of work I loved. I found a box of old patterns in the back of my closet, designs I'd drawn decades ago but never made, dreams I'd put aside for practical work, for paying bills, for raising a family. I spread them out on my table and studied them in the lamplight. Maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe at 67, I could still make something beautiful just for me. The 60 days passed in a strange, cold silence. Marcus and Vanessa looked at apartments they couldn't afford. They argued about money. They blamed me to little Marco, who stopped mentioning it to me, but I could see the weight of it in his eyes. 3 weeks before they had to leave, Marcus came upstairs. Not angry this time, defeated. He sat on the edge of my chair and put his head in his hands. "I'm sorry, Ma. I'm so sorry." I kept sewing. Straight lines, steady hands. For what specifically? For using you. For taking your money. For making you feel like you didn't belong in your own house. He looked up at me, and for a second I saw my little boy, the one who used to help me pin patterns, the one who cried when Marco died. I don't know what happened to me. "You got comfortable," I said. "You stopped seeing me as your mother and started seeing me as a resource." He flinched. "That's harsh. That's honest." He sat with that for a while. Then he said, "Can we start over? After we move? Can we fix this?" I stopped sewing and looked at him. Really looked at him. "I don't know, Marcus. That's up to you. But understand this. I'm not your safety net anymore. I'm not your backup plan. I'm your mother. And I deserve to be treated like a person, not a convenience." He nodded. He didn't argue. That was something. 2 weeks later, they moved out. An apartment in Queens. Smaller, cheaper, theirs. Little Marco cried when they packed his room. Not because of the apartment, but because he was leaving me. I promised him I'd visit. I promised I'd teach him to sew. I promised I'd always be his nonna. The day they left, I stood in the empty living room and felt the house breathe. My house. Finally mine again in a way it hadn't been for years. I didn't rent out their rooms. I didn't need to. The property taxes were covered. The utilities were manageable. And for the first time since Marco died, I had money in my account that stayed there. Not much, but enough. Enough for me. I turned the second bedroom into a proper sewing studio. The third became a guest room for little Marco when he visited on weekends. The living room stayed as it was, the old couch included. Some things you keep not because they're perfect, but because they remember when you were. 6 months after they moved out, I started taking commissions again. Just small things at first, alterations for neighbors, a christening gown for a woman down the street, but word spread the way it used to, through referrals and reputation, and soon I had work again. Not the kind that made me rich, but the kind that made me feel useful, valuable, seen. Little Marco came every other weekend. We'd set up fabric on my big table and I'd teach him basic stitches. He had good hands, patient hands. He told me about school, about his friends, about how his parents were doing better now, stressed but better, working together instead of blaming each other. Marcus called once a month, brief conversations, surface level. "How are you, Ma?" "Good." "You?" "Good." We weren't fixed, but we weren't broken beyond repair either. Maybe that was enough for now. One Sunday morning, little Marco asked me, "Nana, why did you let them stay so long, if it was your house?" I thought about it while threading a needle. Because I thought that's what love looked like, giving until there was nothing left, making yourself smaller so others could be bigger. But I was wrong, Tesoro. Love isn't about shrinking. It's about standing your full height and letting the people around you do the same. He nodded, serious beyond his 9 years. "I think I get it." "Good. Don't forget it when you're grown." That evening, after he went home, I sat by my window with a cup of tea and watched the sun set over the brownstones. The light turned everything golden, the way it used to when Marco was alive, when we'd sit together in this exact spot and plan our retirement, our travels, our someday. We didn't get our someday, but I got something else. I got my dignity back. I got my space back. I got myself back. I opened my wooden box and pulled out Marco's notes, reading through them one more time. At the bottom, underneath everything, I found one I'd never noticed before. The paper was yellowed, the ink faded. It must have been one of the first ones he ever wrote me, back when we were young and still figuring out how to be married. Bella, never apologize for taking up space in your own life. You earned every inch. I pressed the note to my chest and let myself cry. Not sad tears, relieved ones, grateful ones. I'd spent so many years apologizing, bending, shrinking. But I wasn't small. I was never small. I was just taught to fold myself up like one of my patterns, tucked away until someone needed me. But now I was unfolded, full size, taking up exactly the space I deserved. And it felt like coming home to a house I'd been living in all along but had forgotten belonged to me.